Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. This is the calling of every believer and the heartbeat of this podcast. You're listening to Let Us Consider, where we turn to the Bible, theology, and the life of the church to strengthen our faith and encourage one another in Christ. Thank you for joining me again on Let Us Consider. Today we come to consider the story. And last time we were in the book of Ruth, and so this time we will have an introduction to 1 Samuel. Now, if you want a key word for 1 Samuel, that word would be kingship, because 1 Samuel traces the transformation of Israel from this corrupt, fragmented collection of tribes, wherein every man did what was right in his own eyes, according to Judges 21:25, and it traces the history through the last judge, Samuel, and then through Saul, the first king, and then through David, the king, the man after God's own heart. And, of course, all of this is talking about and foreshadowing the ultimate king to come, the seed of the woman who will reign and rule forever. So 1 Samuel was written by an unknown author. Like many of the books for the last couple of times, we don't know who the author was exactly, but we know it must have been sometime between the kingdom split, somewhere around 930 BC, and then the Assyrian devastation and conquest of northern Israel in 722 BC, when northern Israel went into captivity. And so then it was written sometime in there, most likely. And then 1 Samuel covers dates about 100 years or so. I have written down here 1105 to 1011 BC. 1105 through 1011, that is 1 Samuel, just about 100 years of history. And it's fairly easy to outline, and it's really nice to outline because you don't have to remember a lot of verse numbers, just chapters. So 1 Samuel has 31 chapters. The first 7 talk about Samuel. The next, however many, 8 through 15, talk about Saul. And then the next half of the book, 16 through 31, speaks of David. That's all you have to remember. Samuel, Saul, David. Samuel, 1 through 7, Saul, 8 through 15, David, 16 through 31. Fairly nice and easy outline. Now, let's walk through the book as well as we can. Chapter 1 introduces us to a man from a place called Ramathaim Zophim, from the hill country of Ephraim, so northern, one of the northern tribes of Israel, and this man's name was Elkanah. And you remember that Elkanah had 2 wives. The name of one was Peninnah, and the other was Hannah. And Hannah, of course, is actually listed first, and she was what you might call the beloved wife, and she had no children. And so he had another wife named Peninnah, and Peninnah was blessed with children. And verse 6, she would bitterly provoke Hannah and irritate her, since the Lord had closed Hannah's womb. And so it happened year after year that as often as she would go up to the house of the Lord, Peninnah would provoke Hannah, and so Hannah would weep, and she would not celebrate the festival. And so Elkanah, the husband, would ask Hannah, "Why are you so sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" And so at this point, at one of these times that they're there in Shiloh, at the tabernacle, celebrating this feast, Hannah arises, and she goes, and she has this great distress, verse 10, and she's praying to the Lord at the doorway of the tabernacle, and she's weeping bitterly. And she makes a vow and says, "O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on my affliction, and you will give a son to me, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head." And you remember that the priest, Eli, is there, and he's watching all of this. And Hannah's not praying out loud. She's praying within her heart. And her lips are moving, but no sound is coming out. And so Eli, apparently unaccustomed at this time to see people come and pray at the tabernacle, thinks that she's drunk. And he tells her, "Put away your wine." And Hannah says, "No, my Lord, I'm not drunk. I'm a woman oppressed in spirit, and I've poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I have spoken until now out of my great concern and provocation." And so then Eli answers and says, "Well, go in peace, and may the Lord grant your petition that you've asked of him." And so they arose, worshipped, and then they went home. And over the course of time, the Lord remembered Hannah. And Hannah conceived, gave birth to a son. She named him Shemuel, because she asked him of the Lord. And so then Elkanah will go up, just as he always would, to go up for the yearly sacrifice and pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, and she said, "I will not go up until this child is weaned." And so she remained and nursed him until she weaned him. And once she weaned him, she took him with her, and with a 3-year-old bull and an ephah of flour and a jug of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh, even though the child was young. And they sacrificed, and they brought the child to Eli. And she says, "I am that woman that was standing here pouring out my soul to the Lord. And it was for this boy I prayed," verse 27, "and the Lord has given me my petition which I asked of him." And so I've dedicated him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he's dedicated to the Lord. And so Samuel worshipped the Lord there. And that he stayed there. And I mean, I can't imagine how difficult it would be to leave my child there. Of course, knowing you would see him again, knowing that he would be very well taken care of, and knowing that he's really next to maybe his mother, the best place that he really could be. And Hannah prays in chapter 2, and I really encourage you to study this prayer and to know it well. Hannah has this fantastically biblical and prophetic prayer, and it's really up there in one of the songs and prayers of the Bible. And she says, "My heart exults in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth speaks boldly against my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. There is no one holy like the Lord. Indeed, there is no one besides you, nor is there any rock like our God." And she keeps going. I won't rehearse all of it, but go down to verse 10 at the end of the prayer. She says, "The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king, and he will exalt the horn of his anointed." And the word there is Mashiach. That's what the word anointed translates. Mashiach, or as the New Testament, Christos. And so already you're having this reference to Messiah, to Christ. You may say, well, it's in that general sense of the king was just anointed. And I want to point out that yes, that's very true, but that always pointed forward to the ultimate Mashiach, the ultimate Christ who would come. And here, before there's even a king in Israel, Hannah knows her Torah so well that she knows, first of all, God will raise up a king in Israel, right? He told them that in Deuteronomy. But already by Genesis, by the end of Genesis, there's enough theology of a king who is coming, a Mashiach or a Christos, even though that word isn't necessarily used. There's enough understanding of this seed of the woman who's going to come, who's going to rule, and who's going to reign, and who's going to bring about the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant, and who's going to be from the tribe of Judah, and who's going to come, and the staff, the ruler's scepter, is going to be his, and he's going to usher in and rule during this time of great abundance. And so this is what she's thinking of. And she leaves, and Elkanah leaves. They leave Samuel there to minister to the Lord before Eli the priest. Okay, then we're told about Eli's sons and how sinful they were. And then we're told about Samuel ministering to the Lord as a boy. You see Eli rebuking his sons. Verse 3, you have the famous prophetic call to Samuel. Samuel, Samuel, and he runs to Eli. Here I am. Eli says, I did not call you. And this happens a couple of times. And then finally Eli realizes it's the Lord calling the boy. And then he instructs Samuel, go to your bed. Next time you hear your name, just say, Lord, here I am. And then he did this, and the Lord speaks to Samuel and gives him this message. And for this little boy, however old he was at the time, for this little kid to have such a weighty message from the Lord to have to give to Eli, the high priest, and a father figure at this point to Samuel, that Eli's two sons are going to be killed by the Lord because of their sins. That's a very difficult message, but once Eli kind of pries it out of Samuel in the morning, Samuel is very faithful to deliver the message of the Lord to Eli. And this comes true. The next section, Israel is very foolish, takes the Ark of the Covenant out. Even though their hearts are far from God, they assume that just because they have this symbol of God's presence, the Ark of the Covenant, God is going to give them the victory. And of course, God is not one that's going to play these games. And so he delivers them into the Philistines' hand. The ark is captured by the Philistines. Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli, are killed. Eli learns of this, and in shock, he falls back dead, and he dies. And then you have this statement in verse 21, the glory has departed from Israel. In fact, Phinehas's wife, who is giving birth at the time, names her child this, Ichabod. The glory has departed from Israel because the ark of God was taken because of her father-in-law and her husband. She said, the glory has departed from Israel. And then it's emphatic. It says it again, for the ark of God was taken. That's at the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5 and 6, you have this really kind of fun story of the ark in the Philistine cities. They kind of pass it around, and they have all this trouble with it. Finally, they send it back, and it makes it back into Israel. And then you have chapter 7. There's this deliverance from the Philistines, and Samuel judges Israel. Verse 15 of chapter 7, Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. And he would go on this circuit every year, this trip to visit Bethel, Gilgal, Mizpah, and he would kind of go place to place around all this area to judge Israel. And then he would go back to Ramah, because that's where he lived, and then for the rest of the year, from Ramah, he would judge Israel. And he even built an altar there to the Lord. Okay, chapter 8, Samuel becomes old, and he's appointing his sons as judges over Israel. However, his sons, verse 3, did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel came to Samuel at Ramah and said, okay, you're old. Your sons are not godly. Appoint a king for us to judge us. And note this, circle this, have this forefront in your thinking, like all the nations. Okay, that's what they wanted. That's what this was about. We want to be like all the rest of the nations. And so Samuel is displeasing in his sight. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. God said, they've not rejected you. They've rejected me from being king over them. and they're just doing what they've done ever since I brought them up out of Egypt. They're forsaking me, they're serving other gods, and they're doing that to you now. So warn them and tell them of what the king is going to do to them. So Samuel does that. He tells them all of these bad things that's going to happen if they get a king. And they say, no, that's okay. We want to have a king. And so the Lord said, listen to their voice and appoint a king. And so Samuel dismissed them. Now, we're introduced to Saul. And I kind of have to skim over this a little bit for time. But you remember that Saul had lost some donkeys. And he needed to go and find the donkeys. And so they hear about this seer named Samuel who could help them find the donkeys. And so the Lord, works all of this out where Saul comes to Samuel and asks about the donkeys, and Samuel receives Saul as a very distinguished guest and invites him to this dinner, places him at head of the table, and speaks to him and anoints him as king. Yes. And so once Samuel anoints Saul, chapter 10, he pours oil on his head and says, has not the Lord anointed you a ruler for his inheritance? And so then Saul is privately at this point chosen as king, and then in verse 17, he is presented to the people, and he is anointed publicly as the king of Israel. All right, chapter 11, Saul actually starts off fairly good. He has some really good moments. Saul defeats the Ammonites. And then chapter 12, you have Samuel talking to Israel again. He's telling, here I've put a king before you. I'm old and gray. My sons are with you. I've walked before you from my youth even to this day. And I've not defrauded you. If anyone has a witness against me before the Lord and his Mashiach, his anointed, his king, whose ox I've taken, whose donkey I've taken, whom I've defrauded, whom I've oppressed, whatever bribe I've taken, I will restore that. And all the people say, well, we know of nothing. You've not defrauded us, you've not oppressed us, you've not been bribed. And so Samuel said, the Lord is witness against you and against his Mashiach, his witness, or his anointed is witness this day that you found nothing in my hand. He said, he is our witness. And he rehearses this time of the judges up to the present where they've chosen this king. And he says, now here is this king that the Lord has set over you. If you will not fear the Lord and serve him, verse 14, and listen to his voice and not rebel against the command of the Lord, then both you and also the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God. But if you will not listen to the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the command of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you as it was against your fathers. And so he's exhorting them to fear the Lord and be godly and to listen. But you already know that there's going to be this disobedience. And so in chapter 13, you have a war with the Philistines, and you have Saul's first disobedience, wherein he assumes the priestly office because he's not patient enough to wait for Samuel. In chapter 14, we're introduced to Jonathan, Saul's son, and you see Jonathan's wisdom. Jonathan would have actually, I think, made a wonderful king. However, the sin of his father ended the dynasty before it ever got to a second generation. And you have Saul's foolishness then contrasted with Jonathan's wisdom here in this chapter. And then chapter 15, you have more disobedience, outright disobedience from Saul, who spares the king, Agag, instead of punishing him and killing him. Agag, the king of the Amalekites, was left alive by Saul here in chapter 15. And so God ripped the kingdom away from Saul on that day. And you see, verse 35, Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Okay, chapter 16, you get introduced to David with that wonderful story about God sending Samuel to Bethlehem in order to go to the house of Jesse, in order to find a king from one of his sons. And this is where you get the point where the boys are being paraded before Samuel, and Samuel's saying, "Oh, it's that one. Oh, yes, it's that one. He looks strong. He looks good. He looks like a king. He carries himself well," and so on and so forth. And God keeps saying, "Do not look at appearance or at the height of his stature, because I've rejected him and him and him and him. For God sees not as a man sees, but man looks outward, but the Lord looks at the heart." Okay, and so you have David anointed, and the Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul, verse 14, and an evil spirit from the Lord is sent to terrorize Saul. And so they go out and they are looking for a skillful musician who can soothe Saul while this evil spirit comes upon him. And irony of ironies, they find David. And of course, this is all from the hand of the Lord. In God's providence, David is brought to Saul in order to play for him. Now, chapter 17, the Philistines gathered together for battle. And this may or may not be before chapter 16. The chronology doesn't necessarily have to always be one after the other. It seems that chapter 17 could come before 16 because in chapter 17 they're not recognizing David. But either way, you have this insertion next about Goliath and David's confrontation with Goliath. And so having been introduced to David in chapter 16, whether this is before or after this event in chapter 17, we know that God has seen something special in David. And we're seeing an irony already in that there's this contrast between David and Saul. And so chapter 17 brings it out, where Saul, the king, who should be leading his men, first of all in godliness and then in battle, is cowering before this Philistine giant, while David comes to bring his brother's supplies and sees the giant and says, "Well, why isn't anybody doing anything about this? Are we just going to let this uncircumcised brute terrorize the troops of the Lord of hosts?" And so he steps forward and he accepts the challenge. And long story short, he is victorious. He takes his sling and stones, and it seems in just one shot, he literally one-shots Goliath and then chops off his head with Goliath's sword. And like I said, they don't recognize David, and so Saul has David brought, and he's looking at David and just this young man, and he's trying to figure out who is this man, and he starts to sense that there's promise in this young man. And you see Saul actually very quickly start to become afraid of David. But in chapter 18, Jonathan and David develop this friendship. And Saul turns against David in this chapter very quickly because there's this saying that people are talking about. Saul is slain his thousands, David is 10,000s. And so the king, of course, is angry because this young man is taking all of his fame. He's outdoing him. Saul's slaying his thousands, but David has slain his tens of thousands. And so Saul looked on David with suspicion from that day on, because he knew that the Lord had ripped the kingdom out of his hands and was going to give it to another. And so here is David rising meteorically in Israel, and Saul's not stupid. I mean, sin has made him pretty dumb, but he's not stupid by any means, and so he understands that there is going to rise up another king, and it very well, in his estimation, could be David. And of course we know, as the audience, as the reader, that God has already anointed David secretly as the next king. Okay, now, long story short, I'm going to have to really hurry here, but at the end of chapter 18, David marries Michal, Saul's daughter. And then in chapter 19, you have Saul pursuing David, and David's protected. Chapter 20, you have more about the friendship of David and Jonathan, and you actually have this covenant that is cut between David and Jonathan. Verse 15, you shall not cut off your loving kindness from my house forever, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. Jonathan understands. David may have even confided in Jonathan that he was indeed anointed as the next king. And you see the humility and the godliness of Jonathan here, just saying, great, I will support you, and I want you to make this covenant with me that you will not cut off my house when you do. And so you have Saul being angry with Jonathan at the end of this chapter. Jonathan going out saying, hey, flee, my father really is angry. And so David again is on the run, and he's pretty much on the run for the rest of this time. Samuel dies in chapter 25. You have the episode with David and Nabal in chapter 25, and David marrying Abigail. And then chapter 26 goes back to the tension between Saul and David. And then chapter 27, you have David fleeing to the Philistines and seeking sanctuary, essentially, seeking safety there. And so then chapter 28, you have Saul with the spirit medium, even though magic and sorcery were outlawed in Israel. And Saul, for all the bad things he did something here very well. He got rid of all of these seers and spiritists that were talking to demons, essentially. And now he's seeking one out because he can't get the Lord to answer him by the Urim and the Thurim, and he can't get him to answer him by the prophets or by dreams. And so he seeks out this medium, essentially a psychic, is how I was explaining it to my kids the other day. He's seeking out this psychic in order that he can learn from the Lord what he's supposed to do in this situation. And the Lord actually allows this psychic to call forth Samuel in this kind of seance. And Samuel comes and speaks to Saul. Nothing good, of course. And you have this very strange episode here. Very funny always, because the woman's terrified because this is actually happening. Very different from, apparently, than anything that had ever actually happened. And so then Samuel delivers this message to Saul and then disappears. Chapter 29 goes back to David among the Philistines. And you find David actually going in and out among the Philistines, and he's even leading his mighty men among the Philistines. And supposedly he's doing good things for the Philistines, but he's actually going off and he's terrorizing other parts of the Philistines. And so he's doing all of these things. And the Philistines actually distrust him, except for the big king. They all distrust him. And David turns and he has victory in chapter 30 over the Amalekites. And I know I'm really glossing over a lot here and probably not even summarizing well. But in chapter 31, the very end of the book, you have Saul and his sons all slain. And you remember the battle was going badly. The Philistines, verse 2, overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. And the archers hit Saul. He's badly wounded. So he tells his armor-bearer, draw your sword, pierce me through with it. Otherwise, these uncircumcised are going to come and kill me and make sport of me. But his armor-bearer wouldn't do it, so Saul fell on his sword. And then the armor-bearer did so to die with him. And in this way, then, Saul and his sons all died. And this was clearly of the Lord. This was not something that David did. And it was very clear that this wasn't something that David did. And in fact, David's going to mourn so hard for this so hard for them that it's going to be obvious that this was not a plot, this was not a conspiracy. David did not take the kingdom by force. In fact, the author of Samuel's gone over and above him, all kind of expectation to show that David could have killed Saul and Jonathan so many times. But instead, he's made this covenant with Jonathan. He loved Jonathan as a brother, and he loved Saul, and he tried several times to talk Saul off the ledge, but Saul just couldn't be persuaded, so far gone in sin and depravity and in just craziness. And so the kingdom comes to David, not by any doing of his own or by any conspiracy of his own, but simply because it was of the Lord and in the Lord's timing. So that is the book of 1 Samuel, and we'll pick up with considering the story next week in 2 Samuel. Thank you for listening to Let Us Consider. If this podcast has been a blessing, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps others discover the truth of God's Word. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you.